June 7, 1954. Early afternoon. A small house in Wilmslow, England. Alan Turing's housekeeper finds him dead in his bedroom, lying peacefully as if asleep except for the foam around his mouth and a half-eaten apple on his bedside table. The apple is laced with cyanide. Turing is 41 years old, and the man who broke the Nazi Enigma code, who shortened World War II by an estimated 2 years, who saved countless millions of lives through his mathematical genius, has killed himself after being chemically castrated by the British government for the crime of being homosexual. This is how one of the 20th century's greatest minds ends. Not in glory or honor, but in lonely suicide. Persecuted by the same government he helped save. Destroyed by laws that criminalized his nature. Forgotten by a nation that owed him everything but gave him nothing, except humiliation and hormones that altered his body and mind. Turing's story is triumph and tragedy intertwined, brilliance and persecution, world-changing achievement and personal destruction. The tale of a man who is simultaneously one of the war's greatest heroes and one of post-war. Britain's most shameful victims. Alan Matheson Turing is born June 23, 1912. In London to Julius and Ethel Turing. His father works for the Indian Civil Service, which means Alan and his older brother, John, spend much of their childhood separated from their parents who are posted in India. Alan grows up awkward and odd, brilliant at mathematics and science, but socially inept, unable to understand or follow social conventions that seem obvious to everyone else. Displaying characteristics we'd now recognize as autism spectrum, but which in 1920s Britain simply mark him as strange and difficult. He attends Sherborne School, a traditional English boarding school, where his mathematical gifts are recognized, but where he's also bullied and isolated for his oddness, for his inability to fit in, for his obsession with science and math, while other boys care about sports and social status. At Sherborne, he falls in love with another student named Christopher Morcom, though whether Christopher returns these feelings or even knows about them remains unclear. The relationship is intense friendship at minimum, and quite possibly Turing's first love, though the exact nature remains ambiguous given the era's attitudes. Christopher dies suddenly from tuberculosis in 1930, devastating young Turing, who pours his grief into mathematics and science, throwing himself into understanding the physical world with intensity that might be compensation for losing someone he couldn't save. He goes to King's College, Cambridge, where his mathematical genius flourishes, where he's elected fellow at just 22, where he begins developing ideas about computation and logic that will eventually revolutionize mathematics and create the foundation for modern computing, though this future isn't yet visible. In 1936, Turing publishes a paper titled On Computable Numbers that introduces the concept of what becomes known as the Turing machine, a theoretical device that can perform any mathematical computation if given the right instructions. This seems like abstract mathematical philosophy with no practical application. Just another obscure paper in a specialized journal. But Turing has actually invented the theoretical foundation for all modern computers, has described in mathematical terms exactly how a universal computing machine would work, has created the concept that will eventually become laptops and smartphones and the entire digital revolution. But in 1936, none of this practical application is obvious. Turing's paper is appreciated by mathematicians for its theoretical elegance, but nobody realizes he's described the future of human civilization. He goes to Princeton to study under Alonzo Church, works on mathematical logic, considers staying in America, where his oddness seems more accepted and where opportunities seem greater, but ultimately returns to England in 1938. Just as Europe slides toward war that will define his life and legacy. The government code and cipher. School recruits Turing in 1938. recognizing that his mathematical genius might be useful for breaking enemy codes, though exactly how isn't yet clear. When war begins in September 1939, Turing reports to Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in the English countryside that becomes the center of British code-breaking efforts, where brilliant but odd mathematicians and linguists and chess players work to break German military codes that protect Nazi communications from interception. The challenge is enormous. German military uses Enigma machines to encrypt their messages. These machines look like typewriters, but contain rotors that scramble messages according to settings that change daily. Each message is encrypted using different rotor positions and plugboard connections, creating trillions of possible combinations that make the code essentially unbreakable through traditional methods. You'd need to try every possible combination, which would take longer than the universe's age. Using 1940s technology, previous Polish codebreakers made initial progress against. Enigma before the war developed techniques and shared information with British intelligence before Poland fell. But the Germans continually modified their Enigma procedures, making the Polish methods obsolete. Turing and his colleagues at Bletchley Park must break the new versions, must find weaknesses in the encryption system, must develop methods for rapidly testing possible rotor settings to find each day's correct configuration before the settings change at midnight, making all their work useless. Turing recognizes that pure mathematical analysis isn't enough. They need machines to test possible settings faster than humans can calculate. They need to mechanize the code-breaking process. He designs a device called the bomb, an electromechanical computer that can rapidly test Enigma settings by exploiting weaknesses in how German operators use the machines, looking for contradictions that eliminate impossible settings until only the correct one remains. The first bomb becomes operational in March 1940. Eventually, over 200 are built. They become the workhorses of Bletchley Park's operation. The bomb isn't a computer in the modern sense. It's a specialized device for one specific task. But it represents a crucial step toward Turing's vision of universal computing machines. More importantly, it works. The bombs break Enigma regularly, allowing British intelligence to read German military communications with remarkable consistency, though never with complete reliability. Sometimes the codes resist breaking. Sometimes the Germans change procedures that block decryption for days or weeks. But overall, the system works well enough to provide invaluable intelligence. Enigma gives Britain access to German military plans, allows Royal Navy to route convoys away from U-boat wolf packs, enables RAF to anticipate Luftwaffe raids, provides intelligence about German dispositions and intentions across all theaters. The intelligence from Bletchley Park is codenamed Ultra and is among the war's most closely guarded secrets. So secret that sometimes British commanders must allow attacks to succeed rather than reveal that they've broken German codes, must sacrifice soldiers and civilians to protect the greater secret that provides long-term advantage. Turing's role extends beyond designing the bomb. He leads research into breaking naval Enigma, which uses more complex procedures than Army or Luftwaffe versions. He develops statistical techniques for extracting information from partially decrypted messages. He helps break other German cipher systems, including the Lorentz cipher, used for high-level communications between Hitler and his field commanders. His colleagues describe him as brilliant but odd. He rides his bicycle to work, wearing a gas mask during pollen season to manage his allergies. He chains his coffee mug to the radiator so no one can steal it. He's socially awkward and sometimes abrasive, but undeniably gifted. The exact contribution of ultra-intelligence to Allied victory remains debated. Historians estimate it shortened the war by 2 to 4 years. That's millions of lives saved. Millions of Jews who might have survived if the Holocaust had ended sooner. Countless destruction prevented by earlier victory. Eisenhower, after the war, says Ultra made the invasion of Europe possible. Churchill says the Bletchley Park Codebreakers made the single most important contribution to Allied victory. Modern historians generally agree that breaking Enigma was decisive, though quantifying exactly how decisive remains difficult. But Turing's contribution extends beyond even this world-changing code-breaking work. In 1943, he travels to United States to share code-breaking techniques with American counterparts and to assist with breaking Japanese codes. He works at Bell Labs on speech encryption systems. He's exposed to early American computing projects. He begins thinking about more ambitious computing machines than the specialized devices at Bletchley Park. He envisions true universal computers that could be programmed to perform any logical task, not just code breaking. After the war ends in 1945, Turing receives the OBE for his services, though the details of his work remain classified. The public has no idea what happened at Bletchley Park, or who Alan Turing is, or what he contributed. He joins the National Physical Laboratory, where he designs the ACE automatic computing engine, one of the first designs for a stored program electronic computer, a machine closer to his theoretical Turing machine concept than anything yet built. A computer that could be programmed to perform different tasks, rather than being hardwired for single purpose. But bureaucratic delays and funding problems slow ACE's development. Turing grows frustrated with committee meetings and administrative obstacles. He's a pure researcher who wants to build an experiment, not navigate institutional politics. In 1948, he moves to Manchester University, where he works on the Manchester Mark I. Another early computer, he writes some of the first programming manuals, develops early ideas about artificial intelligence, publishes papers about whether machines can think, asks questions that remain central to computer science and philosophy. Of Mind decades later, in 1950 Turing publishes Computing Machinery and Intelligence, a paper that introduces what becomes known as the Turing test for machine intelligence. He proposes that if a computer can convince a human interrogator that it's human through text-based conversation, then it should be considered intelligent. This operational definition of intelligence sidesteps philosophical questions about consciousness and mind and focuses on observable behavior. The test remains influential and controversial. AI researchers still debate whether passing the Turing test constitutes real intelligence or merely convincing simulation. But the paper establishes Turing as founder of artificial intelligence field decades before AI becomes mainstream. He's also working on mathematical biology, developing equations modeling how patterns form in nature, how a leopard gets its spots, or how plants develop their structures. Applying mathematical analysis to biological questions in ways that seem odd given his background in pure mathematics and computing, but that demonstrate his wide-ranging curiosity. His papers on morphogenesis, the development of form and pattern in organisms, are pioneering work in mathematical biology that influences the field for decades, though this contribution receives less attention than his computing work. But while Turing is making these contributions to multiple fields, while he's helping create the foundation for modern computing and artificial intelligence, his personal life is becoming increasingly dangerous because homosexuality is illegal in 1950s Britain. The law criminalizes gross indecency between men, carries penalties including imprisonment, chemical castration, social ruin, career destruction. Homosexuality is considered both crime and mental illness, requiring treatment or punishment or both. Many gay men live in secrecy and fear, avoiding relationships or conducting them in hiding, always aware that discovery means prosecution. Turing doesn't hide his nature from people he trusts. He's open with friends and colleagues about being gay, though discreet about relationships. He seems almost naive about the danger he faces, or perhaps he simply refuses to live in complete denial of who he is. In December 1951, he begins a relationship with a young man named Arnold Murray, whom he meets in Manchester. They sleep together at Turing's house. Turing apparently cares for Murray, though the relationship seems somewhat one-sided, with Turing more emotionally invested than Murray. In January 1952, Turing's house is burgled, probably by an acquaintance of Murray's. Nothing of great value is taken, but Turing reports the burglary to police, which proves to be a catastrophic mistake. During the investigation, Turing mentions his relationship with Murray, perhaps thinking the relationship is relevant to the burglary, or perhaps simply being honest in ways that are dangerous. The police immediately shift focus from the burglary to the homosexual relationship, which is itself a crime. They arrest both Turing and Murray for gross indecency. Turing is charged with violating Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. The same law used to prosecute Oscar Wilde in 1895. He could receive up to 2 years in prison, which would destroy his career and quite possibly kill him given prison conditions for gay men. His friends urge him to plead not guilty to fight the charges. But Turing pleads guilty, perhaps thinking honesty is best, or perhaps simply unwilling to lie about who he is, even when lying might save him. He admits to the relationship with Murray, provides details to the court, makes no attempt to deny or minimize his actions. At trial in March 1952, the judge offers Turing a choice: prison or probation with mandatory hormone treatment to cure his homosexuality, chemical castration through synthetic estrogen injections that will reduce his libido and supposedly eliminate his sexual attraction to men. Turing chooses the hormone treatment over prison, perhaps thinking he can endure temporary medical intervention better than imprisonment, perhaps believing the treatment will eventually end and he can return to normal life, perhaps simply making the choice that seems less immediately terrible without fully understanding its long-term consequences. The hormone treatment begins. Turing receives regular estrogen injections that alter his body chemistry. He develops breasts, gains weight, suffers mood swings and depression. His brilliant mind remains intact, but his body is being feminized against his will. He's being chemically altered for the crime of being himself. He continues working on mathematics and computing during this period, publishes papers, advises graduate students, maintains his research program, but colleagues notice changes in his mood and behavior. The treatments are clearly affecting him psychologically as well as physically. The conviction also has professional consequences beyond the medical treatment. Turing's security clearance is revoked because homosexuals are considered security risks, supposedly vulnerable to blackmail by foreign intelligence services. This is particularly cruel irony. The man who helped win World War II through codebreaking is now barred from classified work because of his sexuality. The man who saved millions of lives is deemed untrustworthy by the government he served. His past contributions are apparently forgotten or considered less important than his sexual orientation. He can't travel freely. His passport is confiscated or restricted. He's denied travel to international conferences. His movements are monitored. He's treated like a security threat rather than a national hero. Friends notice his increasing isolation and depression. He makes dark jokes about suicide, talks about the Snow White story where the queen eats a poisoned apple. But people don't realize how serious his mental state has become, or perhaps they recognize the warning signs but don't know how to help in an era when mental health treatment is primitive and when his persecution is sanctioned by law. The hormone treatment ends after 1 year in April 1953. Turing has completed his sentence, but the damage is done both physically and psychologically. His body slowly returns to normal, though some changes persist. But his mental state continues deteriorating. The combination of forced medical treatment, professional humiliation, social stigma, and personal despair creates a situation that becomes increasingly unbearable. He continues his work, but with less enthusiasm. Colleagues notice he seems distracted and sad. He's no longer the energetic, though odd genius they knew before the conviction. On June 7, 1954, Turing is found dead in his home. The inquest determines he committed suicide by cyanide poisoning. The half-eaten apple beside his bed is presumed to be the delivery method, though it's never tested, so he can't be certain. His mother claims his death was accident, that he was conducting chemistry experiments and carelessly ingested cyanide. She refuses to accept that her son committed suicide, perhaps, unable to bear the additional shame of suicide on top of his conviction. But most historians conclude the death was suicide. The circumstances too closely match Turing's previous dark jokes about poisoned apples. His mental state in preceding months suggests someone contemplating ending his life. The coroner records a verdict of suicide, while the balance of his mind was disturbed. The standard British legal formula that allows Christian burial for suicide victims. Turing is buried at Woking Crematorium. His funeral is small and quiet. Most attendees don't know the full extent of his wartime contributions, because that information remains classified. They know he was a mathematician and computer scientist, but not that he was one of the war's greatest heroes. His death receives little public notice. Just another sad story of a troubled man who killed himself. For decades after his death, Turing remains largely forgotten by the general public. His wartime work stays classified until 1970s. Computer scientists know his contributions to their field, but most people have never heard of him. His prosecution and death represent one of the most shameful episodes in British legal history. The persecution of a war hero for his sexuality. The chemical castration of a genius who saved millions. The driving to suicide of one of the 20th century's greatest minds. All sanctioned by law and social attitudes that made homosexuality criminal and gay people targets for persecution. The campaign for Turing's rehabilitation begins slowly. As his wartime work is declassified, historians recognize his crucial role in breaking Enigma. Computer scientists celebrate him as founding figure of their field. Gay rights activists cite him as example of how homophobic laws destroy lives. In 2009, Prime Minister Gordon Brown issues official apology for Turing's treatment, acknowledging that his prosecution was unjust and that Britain owes him enormous debt. Brown calls the treatment appalling and says Turing deserved better from the country he helped. Saved out in 2013, Queen Elizabeth II grants Turing a posthumous royal pardon, formally overturning his conviction, acknowledging that his prosecution was wrong and that he should be honored rather than condemned. The pardon is controversial. Some argue it shouldn't require royal pardon to overturn unjust law, that all men convicted under similar laws should receive pardons, not just famous ones. These criticisms have merit, but the pardon at least acknowledges Britain's injustice toward Turing, even if it doesn't fully address the broader historical wrong. In 2017, the Alan Turing Law provides posthumous pardons to all men convicted under historical laws criminalizing homosexuality, extending to thousands of others what Turing received individually, acknowledging that all these convictions were unjust, not just the one involving a famous mathematician. This broader pardon is important. Step toward addressing historical persecution of gay men in Britain, though it can't undo the damage done to lives destroyed by these laws. Turing's legacy in computer science is now universally recognized. The Turing Award is computing's highest honor, equivalent to the Nobel Prize, given annually to computer scientists for major contributions to the field. Modern computers operate on principles Turing described in his 1936 paper. Every smartphone and laptop is essentially a physical implementation of the Turing machine concept, the digital revolution that transformed human civilization in late 20th and early 21st centuries builds directly on Turing's Theoretical foundations dot his contributions to artificial intelligence remain influential. The Turing test is still debated as definition of machine intelligence. Researchers developing AI systems still reference his papers. His questions about whether machines can think remain central to philosophy of mind and AI ethics. His work on morphogenesis influenced development of mathematical biology and complexity theory. His ideas about self-organizing systems and pattern formation anticipated later developments in chaos theory and emergence. The 2014 film The Imitation Game brings Turing's story to mass audience. Benedict Cumberbatch portrays him as brilliant but troubled genius, persecuted for his sexuality. The film takes dramatic liberties with historical facts, but succeeds in making Turing household name and in highlighting injustice of his treatment. The film's success prompts renewed interest in Turing's life and work, introduces new generations to his story, though some historians criticize the film's inaccuracies and its portrayal of Turing as more socially awkward than. Evidence suggests that the Bank of England announces in 2019 that Turing will appear on the new £50 note, placing his face on British currency alongside Churchill and other national heroes, completing his rehabilitation from convicted criminal to honored hero, from forgotten victim to celebrated genius. The note enters circulation in 2021, features Turing's portrait along with the bomb machine and mathematical notation from his papers. Includes his quote, "This is only a foretaste of what is to come, and only the shadow of what is going to be. But recognition and rehabilitation can't undo the injustice of his persecution, can't restore the years of life and work stolen from him, can't answer the question of what he might have achieved if he'd lived to normal lifespan rather than dying at 41. Turing was working on artificial intelligence, on mathematical biology, on quantum mechanics and physics. He had decades of potential contributions ahead of him that were lost when British society drove him to suicide for being gay. The question of what computing might look like if Turing had lived another 30 or 40 years fascinates historians and computer scientists. Would personal computers have arrived earlier if Turing was working on them in 1960s and 70s? Would artificial intelligence be more advanced if Turing had continued developing his ideas? Would we understand consciousness and thinking better if Turing had more time to explore these questions? We can't know what was lost, but we know something valuable was destroyed when Turing died. His story illustrates broader tragedy of how societies treat people who don't fit social norms, how genius and contribution matter less than conformity to arbitrary standards, how laws criminalizing private consensual behavior destroy lives and waste talent. Thousands of gay men in Britain and millions worldwide faced persecution similar to Turing's, lost careers and lives and freedom for violating laws that had no legitimate purpose. Most of them weren't famous mathematicians, so their stories are forgotten, but each represents an individual tragedy. Turing's awkwardness and apparent autism also raise questions about neurodiversity and how society treats people whose minds work differently. His social difficulties probably made his persecution harder to bear because he lacked social support networks that might have helped him cope. His literal-minded honesty probably contributed to his conviction because he admitted to behavior that others might have denied or hidden. His difference made him vulnerable in ways that more socially adept people could avoid. The tragedy is compounded by the secrecy around his wartime work. If the public had known in 1952 that Turing helped win the war, that he saved millions of lives, that he was a national hero rather than just an obscure mathematician, would the prosecution have proceeded? Would public opinion have prevented his persecution? Would his contributions have protected him from laws that seemed more important than individual lives? We can't know, but the secrecy certainly meant he died without public recognition of his achievements. without the acclaim that might have sustained him through persecution. His mother's refusal to accept the suicide verdict reflects the shame and stigma surrounding both homosexuality and suicide in 1950s Britain. She couldn't admit her son was gay and couldn't admit he killed himself because both were sources of family shame. So she insisted on accident theory that allowed her to maintain different narrative even if no one else believed it. This denial reflects the broader social forces that destroyed Turing. The shame and secrecy that made homosexuality unmentionable, and that made gay people hide or die rather than live openly. The apple beside his bed, whether it actually contained the cyanide or was just coincidental, has become symbol of his death and of the tragedy of his persecution. Apple Inc. has always denied that their logo references Turing, though the connection seems obvious enough that many people believe it. The rainbow-colored Apple logo used in 1980s seems particularly evocative of connection to gay man who died after eating poisoned apple. Whether intentional or not, the association means millions of people carry symbol of Turing's death in their pockets on their iPhones without knowing the story. Modern debates about AI and computing ethics often reference Turing as foundational figure whose questions remain relevant. As AI systems become more sophisticated, the question of whether machines can truly think, or whether they're just simulating thought, becomes practical rather than philosophical. Turing's test provides framework for evaluating machine intelligence even as researchers debate whether it's the right framework. His vision of universal computing machines, capable of performing any logical task, has been realized beyond what he could have imagined in 1936 or even in 1950. The rehabilitation of Turing's reputation demonstrates how social attitudes change. Behavior that was criminal in 1952 is now legal and increasingly accepted. Laws that destroyed lives are now recognized as unjust. People who were persecuted are now celebrated. This change is progress, but it came too late for Turing and for thousands of others whose lives were destroyed by unjust laws. The apologies and pardons are important, but they can't restore what was lost, can't undo the suffering caused by persecution. His story is taught in schools now. Students learn about his contributions to computer science and codebreaking, learn about his persecution and death, learn about injustice of laws that criminalized homosexuality. His life and death become object lessons in multiple subjects, from mathematics to history to ethics. This educational legacy means new generations know his name and his story, remember what happened, and hopefully learn from it. Though whether societies truly learn from history remains questionable. Remember, Alan Turing not just as brilliant mathematician and computer scientist, not just as codebreaker who helped win World War II, but as human being who was persecuted for being himself, who was chemically castrated for loving the wrong people, who was driven to suicide by society that should have honored him. Remember that his genius couldn't protect him from unjust laws, that his contributions to national security couldn't prevent his persecution, that being hero in war didn't make him safe in peace. Remember that his treatment was legal and socially acceptable in 1950s Britain, that most people at the time would have approved of his prosecution, or at least wouldn't have objected to it, that the injustice was systemic rather than individual, that law and society combined to destroy him. Remember that thousands of other gay men faced similar persecution, that Turing's fame makes his story known, but shouldn't make us forget the countless others whose names we'll never know and whose stories are lost. Remember that he died alone at 41 with so much work left undone, so many questions left unexplored, so many contributions left unmade, because British society decided his sexuality mattered more than his genius. That conformity to sexual norms was more important than saving lives or advancing human knowledge. Remember that this was choice society made, not inevitable natural consequence. The laws that persecuted him were written by humans and could have been different. This is Alan Turing, born 1912, died 1954, mathematical genius, computer science pioneer, World War II hero, victim of persecution, symbol of injustice, finally recognized decades too late. He saved millions of lives during the war, then was destroyed by peacetime laws that criminalized love. He laid foundation for digital revolution, then died before seeing his vision realized. He asked questions about machine intelligence that we're still trying to answer 7 decades after his death. His face on the 50 pounds note, his name on computing's highest award, his story taught in schools. These honor his memory, but can't restore his life. The best we can do is remember what happened, learn from the injustice, ensure that genius and contribution and simply being human are valued more than conformity to arbitrary norms. Remember Alan Turing. Remember what he achieved. Remember what was done to him. Remember what was lost when he died. This is his story, triumph and tragedy, brilliance and persecution, the forgotten hero who saved millions and died alone.